and was a beneficiary. We also had a rainy day fund that was much larger. We started about 18 months ago with a $1.5 billion rainy day fund, and that's down to about $570 million. So the other piece is the governor does take a piece of that, I think about somewhere about $250 million out of the stabilization fund to balance out. We may or may not be able to do that. The feeling that we're getting from our hearings is that if we fall below $500 million, that we will risk bond rating, and bond rating then impacts many communities in the state as well that rely on our bond rating. So that's the other piece of the puzzle that got us through last year. In addition, we also raised some revenues, as you know. Those pieces, those are not in our back pocket this time around.
One more additional comment. Also, one of our colleagues here in the Merrimack Valley, Harriet Stanley, chairs the Healthcare Finance Committee, and that is also going to be an issue just for our Commonwealth, regardless of what action is taken at the federal level. We were able to skirt that issue a little bit last year, but our healthcare costs within the Commonwealth are going to be more substantial this year. The one, I think, positive thing that we can say from a policy perspective is I think we're closer, and Senator, you can comment on this as well, we're, I think, a little bit closer in the legislature in terms of extending the liability for pensions. That does seem one thing that is likely to move forward much more so than the issue of health care. So I just wanted to add that as well on the city side of the budget.
Barbara?
Did I hear you, Representative Latalia, that by March we may have a figure for what the budget, at least the House budget, would be? I mean, you know how difficult it is for us. We do budget after budget after budget.
It's called a consensus.
It would be nice if we had at least as close as possible, so we'd have fewer budgets to keep
It's
track of.
called a consensus local aid figure, and it would be done in coordination with the Senate. So you wouldn't be getting a figure and then wondering, gee, will the Senate go along with this? Will they want to cut this? Will they want to increase it? We would be looking at the entire budget, and then we would be sort of forward placing this. So we would be putting this out in advance of when we will do our entire budget. The House will do their budget the third week in April. So yes, we would be giving you your number. It may not be what you like, but you'd be getting your number and you'd be able to build your budget definitively on that. We also have town meetings in towns that start in April, so the sooner that we can get this done, the better. But that's the feeling, is that this year we feel, because we have met our benchmarks, we've kind of crept a little bit above them, that we're confident that we could commit to a number. In some years, you don't want to commit early because you're actually undercutting yourself. In years when revenues are growing, if you lock in early, you're undercutting yourself. Last year, because numbers were falling off the table, we didn't feel like we could commit. And in fact, that was borne out by the fact that by the time we were done our budget and we had new numbers, revenue figures by the end of April, we're off by $1.5 billion. And then the Senate had the terrible position of having to go in and make further cuts, and nobody wants to do that. None of us want to, but the numbers are what they are, and we have to construct a budget that's balanced. So I can't tell you exactly when in March, but I will tell you that if I had a dime for Remember that's called me to ask when it's going to be, I'd be a wealthy woman. So we're going to be pushing it and hopefully getting it done as soon as possible.
Yeah. And it's not a blame game. I mean, it's just that we know it's beyond a lot of people's control, but it certainly helps doing a budget. It's so frustrating to go through all that work and then have to keep changing it. So that'd be a great help. Thank you.
Bob?
Yes, thank you for coming, always, and I appreciate your candor. The only question I have is, last year, 2 years ago, Michael, the head of the Taxpayers Association, and Whitmer. Yes, okay, talked about 2014 as being the upswing year, maybe. Now, my concern is that, and you've touched upon it, the stimulus funding, IDEA monies, we as a district rely heavily on those things. And this coming budget year is the last year, I believe, for $2 or $3 million worth in those accounts. Do you see how it looks, and this is a crystal ball question, but I'm sure, especially on the Ways and Means, they do some projections. of what it might look like in the coming fiscal year. In other words, we know it's going to be tough this year, but next year, many communities are going to be in a tougher, even if things perk up, because the stimulus money that saved jobs and allowed for some creation and whatever is gone. So now we have to build a budget on top of our built-in costs. So do you have any idea of what you're looking at if we looked at a 2-year projection of what's happening? And I know in some places they require 2 and 3 and multiple years.
What I can say is that when we build our consensus revenue figure, the House, Senate, and Administration and Finance, on behalf of the governor, talk with local leading economists and folks from the Federal Reserve Bank. The feeling is that even though the recovery is beginning to happen, it's somewhat of a jobless recovery, and that there's always a lag time in government, because jobs may begin to be created on, slowly, but there's quite a lag between when that happens and when, there are increased capital gains, increased income, increased sales revenue coming back into government coffers. So the feeling is that this is, we will have slow, maybe on the order of 2 to 3% growth this year, but it's really going to take, 2 to 3 more years to begin to see any appreciable difference in terms of revenue picture and being able to look at sort of bringing communities back from the cuts that they've endured.
And Bob, just to add on to that, I think if there's one thing that we would want to take away from this meeting is the importance of us coming together with a consensus revenue number, and we're committed to doing that. I know the House, the Speaker, the Senate President, the Ways and Means chairs, the members of the committee have all reached out to both of our leaders that we need to do that. It's critical as we go forward. Everybody understands that FY11 will probably be the most difficult fiscal year that we've faced in a long time. And you all know the last couple of years have been horrible. So as you go forward, as much as you're beginning to put together your budgets, I would say before you sort of solidify those numbers, I would wait for that consensus revenue to come out in March. Now, if mid-March comes and you haven't heard from us, and I'm sure we'll be talking, you will have a better idea. If it's not going to come, then at that point we need to start preparing for the worst case. But at this point, I think let's wait to see what the consensus revenue will be, and then let's go from there. We'll be happy to come back to talk about it at that point. But that's going to be the key to the success or failure of a lot of programs on the local side as we move forward, is what that consensus revenue number will be. And again, Barbara was right. When the House put its budget together last year, by the time it came over to the Senate, I mean, the numbers just went off the cliff. And, the Senate had a consensus revenue hearing. We brought in Mike Widmer. We brought in all of the experts to talk about where do they believe the numbers are going. And it's always been a downward trend. So from a state's perspective, we haven't really hit that bottom yet in terms of coming up. We might be at the bottom, but it's not up yet, and we're still waiting for that to happen. So we're preparing for the worst case scenario. I think you should as well, but understand that you really won't be able to really predict until we come up with that consensus revenue number, and I think we will.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Superintendent?
Are you convinced that the stabilization stimulus dollars will come in as expected March and those of us who elected to carry some over into FY11, do you believe that it will be there as well?
You're talking about your second payment for this year under the ERA funds?
Yes. Not the IDEA funds.
No, I understand. I understand. Yes, I can give you an answer on this because I have a smaller community that I represent who has very little margin for error, and they're talking about potentially laying people off this year. So what we found out was that the state government filed on January 11th for this second round of ERA funding under education, and they expect the money in by mid to late March. And so that's when you ought to be able to see that money. We spoke directly with with Mitchell Chester, the Commissioner of Department of